Good evening. My name is Marty Schickman, and I'm Director of Eastern Michigan University's Center for Jewish Studies. And I'd like to welcome you to our conversation with Dr. Kenneth D. Wald. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by Hillel at Eastern Michigan University, Eastern Michigan University's Department of Political Science, and the Harold Grinspoon Foundation. I'd also like to thank the board of the Center for Jewish Studies at Eastern Michigan University. Before we begin tonight's event, I'd like to tell you about our next speaker, and that will take place on November 23rd at 7:00 p.m. Our speaker will be Dr. Marshall P. Duke. Dr. Duke is the Charles Howard Chandler Professor of Psychology at Emory University. He is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Family Life and author of 9 books and more than 100 articles focusing on the family and other social learning networks. He is a member of Emory's Center for the Study of Myth and Ritual in American Life and a senior faculty fellow at Emory's Center for Ethics. Over the years, he has appeared on Good Morning America, The Today Show, The Oprah Winfrey Show, my favorite. And his work has been written about in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, Parents Magazine, and Time Magazine. Dr. Duke will be talking about the amazing power of family stories. And if you've ever asked yourself, are your family stories true or not true? Are they Bubba-Meitzes, tall tales, or not? Dr. Duke will talk to you about whether or not they are true, they're not true, and whether or not maybe even what it matters. So please tune in with us on November 23rd at 7:00 p.m. for Dr. Marshall P. Duke and the amazing power of family stories. Tonight, we welcome Dr. Kenneth Wald. And I'm going to have my colleague Jeff Bernstein do the introductions for Dr. Kenneth Wald. But let me introduce Jeff Bernstein first. Jeff Bernstein is my friend, my colleague, my partner in far too many crimes relating to the Center for Jewish Studies, my traveling companion. And he is also very recently a award recipient of Eastern Michigan University's highest teaching honor, the Ron Collins Award for Teaching. He has produced a great deal of and remarkable work in the scholarship of teaching and learning, and I am a huge admirer of his. He is a member of our Department of Political Science, and I'm going to hand everything over to him, Jeffrey Bernstein.
Thank you, Marty. And it's good to be here tonight with everybody. I'm honored to introduce and lead this conversation tonight with Ken Wald. Kenneth D. Wald is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Political Science and the Samuel R. Shorstein Professor Emeritus of American Jewish Culture and Society at the University of Florida. He received his graduate degrees from Washington University in St. Louis and also studied at the London School of Economics. His BA in Political Science was awarded by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Wald conducts research about the role of religion in American public life. His recent books include Religion and Politics in the United States, published in its 8th edition, and Foundations of American Jewish Liberalism, published by Cambridge University Press, and the winner of the 2019 National Jewish Book Award in American Jewish Studies. And I might say a very, very worthy recipient of that award. In 2011, Ken Wald was named Teacher Scholar of the Year, the highest faculty award given by the University of Florida. And I will also say that in addition to being a wonderful scholar, Ken is a very, very nice guy and has been very, very helpful to me as I've been playing around in the sandbox of American Jewish politics a little bit in my own work. So Ken, it's great to have you here tonight in Ypsilanti, at least in spirit. It's probably much warmer where you are down in Florida. But So why don't we get started? We'll throw out a first question to you. Why do American Jews tend to be liberal Democrats? And what's kind of unique and surprising about that fact?
Well, good evening, Jeff. And let me just first thank Marty for inviting me here. Thank you for the work you've done to make this possible. And of course, to thank the however many people, 51 people who, according to my version of Zoom, are listening in. I'd say it's nice to be here, but here is my dining room table, and it's not that big a deal, but it is nice to be with you, even virtually. I guess I want to start by observing that I'm somebody who likes puzzles, and solving puzzles is one of my favorite pastimes. I begin every morning with the New York Times crossword and their spelling bee, and the day doesn't go well if I don't get those things fixed fairly quickly. So when I started thinking about Judaism and politics, not a particular topic I had worked on in the broader study of religion and politics, I was drawn to three puzzles about American Jews. And the first one, as you say, arises from the fact that American Jews are overwhelmingly Democrats and tend to hold very liberal political views. And that is puzzling because they have the social traits, education, income, occupational status, that usually predict Republican identification and conservative policy issues. There's a famous politically incorrect statement made many years ago by a Jewish journalist who observed that American Jews earn like Episcopalians but vote like Puerto Ricans, making the same sense that they're an affluent group, but other groups like Episcopalians tended to be Republican, whereas they vote like Puerto Ricans, who as a community were less affluent and were Democratic. But there are also two other puzzles that intrigued me. One is when I looked around the world, that American Jews, the only diaspora community we know of where the majority of Jews are on the left side of the country's political agenda. There are a lot of different patterns, but only here do we find Jews aligned with the left of the political spectrum. And then finally, while Jews are overwhelmingly Democratic and have been for a long time, the level of attachment can go up and down in ways that are not always self-evident. So those were really the three puzzles that brought me into this question.
So let's talk about the sort of temporal variability of Jewish voting behavior. What have been some examples of where the Jewish vote has gone particularly more Democratic, and what have been historical examples of where the Jewish vote has been less Democratic over the years?
Yeah, I can take that one fairly easily. If you look at the Jewish vote from, say, the late 1940s, the time of Harry Truman, until the late 1960s, Jews were very heavily Democratic, typically voting about 3-to-1 Democratic. It could vary from election to election, but by and large, it was massively disproportionately Democratic. And then what started to happen in the late 60s and early 70s is the Jewish vote moved in a Republican direction. I want to stress Jews were still 2-to-1 Democrats to 1 Republican, but that was a lower level than had been the case prior to the 1960s. And the reason I think was that Jews perceived the Democratic Party and the liberal movement as violating a core belief of their political culture. And that is classic liberalism, that the state, the government, should not apportion benefits or costs based on religion, race, ethnicity. And the issue of affirmative action was particularly challenging for Jews because many perceived it as a violation of classic liberal values. And they tended to move away from the Democratic Party, still being a majority, but moving away. But then in the late 1980s, Jews began moving back to the Democratic Party. And that was striking because the other groups in the Democratic coalition that like Jews had moved away from the party never went back, but Jews did. And the reason I argue is that they saw what they perceived as a greater threat to Jewish political interests, the rise of the movement called the Christian right, which in time became the base of the Republican Party. And for Jews, the Christian right's call for more religion in politics, lowering the wall separating religion and state, seemed really threatening.
So would you say that So if you consider, say, Orthodox Jews or more religiously observant Jews, did they respond negatively to the increasing religiosity of the Republican Party? Did they respond the same way that perhaps other members of the Jewish community did?
Well, of course, Orthodoxy is a very diverse community. It does not seem to have been a problem for the Orthodox in the way that it was for non-Orthodox Jews. And the reason is Orthodox Jews are more morally traditional, and they don't have as deep objections as other Jews to the use of public money to fund religious activities. They see it as money and support that could help maintain their own community. So the Orthodox Jews, as well as those Jews who came to the US from Russia as adults after 1989, were also more Republican. But they are a relatively small share of the overall Jewish community, but they are notably less democratic than of the rest of the Jewish community.
So let's bring it up more up to date now. Talk about how Barack Obama did among American Jews in terms of getting the Jewish vote, and how did that compare to how Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago?
Yeah, I wonder if we could go to the third slide, and maybe I can show you some numbers to make that case.
Always a fan of numbers.
We lose our union cards if we don't show some of them.
That's right. Okay.
Oops. All right, so here we see some data about the Jewish vote between 72 and 2008. And I'll have to fill in what happened a bit later. And look at that third column that says Democratic share of the two-party vote. This takes out third-party candidates, which differed from election to election. And if you look at the first 5 elections, you see that Jews were about 2-to-1 on average Democratic. If you look starting in 1992, when I think Jews began to recognize the Christian right and conservative Catholics as the new Republican base, you see a dramatic upsurge in Jewish Democratic voting. And you'll see that sometimes Jews were 4-to-1, sometimes Jews were 3-to-1. The numbers here differ a little bit from those you usually see because we did some analysis here that better weighted the sample of Jews based on geography and other criteria, but much more heavily Democratic in those last 5 elections. And that extended through both 2008, 2012, and 2016. Barack Obama was closer to the 80% mark than Hillary Clinton was in 2016, but there really wasn't much of a difference in the Democratic share of the vote. When you consider how unpopular Hillary Clinton was, broadly speaking, how she had strong negatives in the polls, as did Donald Trump, I guess it's not surprising that she didn't do as well as Obama had done 4 years earlier.
So I'm struck by 1992 as really being very much that point of inflection here in the numbers. And I'm wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about Pat Buchanan and what his role sort of in the 1992 Republican convention.
Yeah, well, 1992 was, I think, the time when the Christian right really became apparent to many observers as the new base of the Republican Party. And again, the majority of that consists of white evangelical Protestants. That's a broader term that would include fundamentalists as well as others who follow that particular tradition. And the Republican Party, which had been fairly liberal on social issues prior to this time, really made a strong outreach to the evangelicals. It didn't begin in 92, but it was kind of consecrated in 1992 when you observed Pat Buchanan speaking at the Republican convention, talking about a crusade, talking about a culture war, really stressing that there was a battle between good and evil. Buchanan had also made what were deemed by many people, including William Buckley, to be anti-Semitic statements. And the fact that he would get a position of honor struck many people as problematic. So I think it kind of signaled to Jewish voters that it was a new kind of Republican Party, much more traditionalist on social issues and much less committed to diversity than had been the case before. And Jews seem to have taken notice and have moved back, as I said, to the position of a 3 or 4 to 1 Democratic to Republican margin.
So a lot of your argument really kind of hinges upon the Christianization of the Republican Party, sort of the Christianization of America and a Jewish response to that. If you look at attitudes around issues of church-state separation, issues of religious displays in the public square, do we see American Jews really looking very different and very uniquely different from other Americans on those issues?
Yeah, there have been enormous differences in polls from the 90s on in attitudes toward questions about religion and state. Whether you're talking about public funding for religious schools, teaching religion in the schools, which many Jews see as being essentially a Christian-oriented movement, or other issues, the use of religious rhetoric in campaigns. Jews are a world apart from much of the rest of the electorate. And it's kind of striking because this is fairly new. I was looking at some data from the point in the early 50s when it was proposed to add the phrase "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, which ultimately did happen by statute. It was interesting that there were differences between Jews, Protestants, and Catholics, but they weren't very large. They really had differences of maybe 10%. Now those differences would be 40 to 50%. And so gradually, as the Republican Party adopted the language that would appeal to particularly conservative Catholics and white evangelicals, it did very poorly, much less well among Jewish Democrats, as had been the case before.
So you'd imagine that after all this time, and really American Jews, by the vast majority of definitions, have made it in the United States, that the American Jewish place in the country, their citizenship, their life here is not threatened and not questioned the way, say, Muslim Americans continue to find. And yet we really see this significant reaction coming. Is this coming from a place of discomfort with their place in the United States, with their belonging in the United States, or is there something else that you see going on?
Well, somebody, I think it was Abba Eban, once said that the problem with American Jews is that they can't take yes for an answer, meaning that here they've achieved levels of success and integration that they could only have dreamed of in many other places. And he didn't understand why so many of them thought anti-Semitism was a problem and were so nervous about some of the trends that we've discussed here. The point I make in the book is that American Jews have developed what we political scientists call a political culture very early after the American founding. It's a set of basic ideas about the purpose of politics and core political values. And this culture was built around a couple of notions. The central notion was that American Jews had rights guaranteed by law because they were citizens. Their rights did not depend on tolerance, which is something that can be given or taken away. It was anchored in law. And furthermore, they felt it was important to recognize that the Constitution of the United States created a state that was secular. Now, secular doesn't mean anti-religious, as many people think it does. It simply refers to things that are outside the domain of the religious or the sacred. And Jews meant that the state was secular in the sense that the state had no religious identity. We didn't have an established church. If you look at the preamble to the Constitution, it says not word one about God or the higher purpose of the country. It's all about we the people. And Jews, because there were restrictions on having religious tests for holding public office that were now forbidden, Jews felt they were part of we the people. And so in a sense, they have looked to the maintenance of that system that separates religion and state, that treats them as different domains, not hostile, but where the state is neutral toward religion and it is treated like any other civil society organization. They see that in a sense as an indicator of how well they are accepted. And when they see the resurgence of what's called God talk, talk about a Christian nation, talk about only the redeemed should have, political rights, or some of the other statements that have been made, they get extremely nervous. And that remains, I think, an underlying factor that became more important again once the Christian right had displaced the old Republican base of mainline Protestants, who are much less likely to use that kind of language and push for those kinds of policies.
One of my favorite parts of your book is where you talked about how this understanding and this arrangement, if you will, that American Jews had with the larger society in the United States is really fairly unique in American Jewish, or in Jewish history and Jewish diasporic history. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that point a little bit.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out for people who forget that the United States is the first place where Jews had both religious freedom and civic freedom. They could, of course, practice their religion without hindrance, thanks to the First Amendment, but they also could engage in public life because, again, the Constitution said that nobody shall be required to adhere to a particular religious view in order to hold public office. And even though some states had requirements to that effect after the Constitution, those became a dead letter very quickly. So Jews very early developed this sense of the importance of having this secular orientation as making them part of the American people. And it's striking how quickly this perception developed and how durable I have found it to be when I look at data from the modern age.
So let's bring this point up to the present now. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, passed away last month, and she was, I think, very much that embodiment of the Jewish civil libertarian, very much opposed to church-state separation. And we now have a case where the Republicans have nominated Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the court, and this is likely to move the court quite a bit to the right around these sorts of church-state issues. I know it's early to look at data, but based on what you've seen and based on what you've discerned over the years, what does this do in the short and long term to American Jewish public opinion?
Yeah, well, I think it's worth going back to the early 1950s to get a sense of how this developed. It's, again, worth remembering it was not until starting in the 1940s and 50s that the First Amendment was applied retroactively to state and local governments. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law about establishment of religion or free exercise. And the question arose, how do you make sense of the constitutional language? And there were really two doctrines about religion and state that emerged in the early 50s. There was what was called separationism, which asserts, again, that religion and state are separate, and the state should keep religion at arm's length, not in a hostile way, but the state does not exist to advance religious purposes. The state has no competence in matters of religion. These are all statements similar to statements that James Madison made. And they believed in general that religious institutions should be outside the sphere of government. They were simply nonprofit organizations. And then on the other hand, you had a point of view called accommodationism, which said there is nothing in the Constitution that would forbid the government from providing what it would call non-discriminatory aid to religious institutions. All institutions would be eligible, nor did they say there was any reason the state couldn't favor religion over irreligion, give religion privileges that were not available to other secular groups, other nonprofits. And those two positions kind of were defined the conflict in the courts and in the jurisprudence. And for the most part, the Supreme Court embraced the separationist position in the 60s and continued for a long time. But there was always a movement by more conservative judges to promote the accommodationist perspective. And Linda Greenhouse, among others, has written that this project to achieve accommodationism has been the underlying goal of a majority of Supreme Court justices. And now, presumably with a 6-3 majority, even leaving out Justice Roberts, the assumption is accommodationism will win the day. And we've seen already in the last session of the court a number of decisions which would have been unthinkable in the past. In effect, the court now has said in two cases, they decided earlier this year, that when it comes to allocating benefits, religious institutions should be on completely equal terms with all non-religious institutions. You can't deny them anything that other institutions get. At the same time, when it comes to giving religious institutions or to allocating burdens, for example, complying with civil rights law, the court said religious institutions can be exempted from some of these burdens when secular institutions cannot. And in general, the Jewish justices who are on the Supreme Court, including Justice Ginsburg, were in the minority in those cases. And of course, now without Justice Ginsburg and with her replacement likely to be a judge who is a protege of Justice Scalia, the accommodationist perspective has essentially won. And I think we'll see more and more cases. And American Jews, I think, are concerned to an even greater degree than most Americans, because to them, this effectively means that Christianity, which is the religion of the majority, is going to get benefits. And they worry about how minority religions will be protected given this perspective. So I think it has reinforced the concern. And some of the grief for Justice Ginsburg was not just because they lost a person they thought was a great judge and a great human being, but because they feel they lost a voice on the court that helped to preserve a balance between religion and state, and that balance appears to be threatened.
So do you see this having an impact in this particular election? Or in your studies and you're looking at things, have Democrats, have Republicans, have Jewish voters been particularly motivated by Justice Ginsburg's passing and the future of the court? Or is that just part of all the other data that's going into this election?
Yeah, I don't think this has been this aspect has been particularly important in the mobilization. Indeed, you can look at survey data from 10 years ago, and when you ask Jews which party they trusted to do certain things, the two things they had the most trust in the Democratic Party to do continue to promote freedom of choice through abortion, and also to defend the separation of religion and state. So that's a very deeply held value. And I think it's just one of the factors that reinforces that commitment. There are particular actions that the Trump administration has taken which raise some real concerns. For example, President Trump issued an executive order to repeal that part of the tax code that says nonprofit organizations that have 501c3 status, that means they're exempt from federal taxation, no longer have to refrain from endorsing candidates for public office. And he's told the other branches of government not to enforce that provision of the tax code. And that's a concern for many Jewish organizations. But I think it's a small concern given the other issues. I mean, health and medicine, the pandemic are the big issues on the Jewish political agenda, much more so than anything else this time around.
Certainly. I remember when EMU Center for Jewish Studies hosted Jim Gerstein a few years ago. Jim put up some data and shared with the crowd that the same issues that a broad national sample of Americans say are their most important issues are the same issues that Jewish voters say are the most important issues, that we're all looking at the same country, we're all concerned about the same things and thinking about the same kinds of issues.
Right.
So let me encourage panelists, attendees here at this webinar, if you have any questions to please pop them into the chat window and I will be happy to look through them and try to throw some of them at Ken as we're moving along here. We're about 25 minutes or so into our conversation. We've not yet really talked about Israel and American Jewish community and the American Jewish reaction, how American Jews think about and vote around the issue of Israel. So let me throw it out to you in this way. President Trump has made many very conspicuous moves, cozying up to the Netanyahu government. He's made many moves with attempts to sort of reach Jewish voters in that way. How has that, or how will that affect the Jewish vote and Jewish regard for President Trump?
Let me answer that in two ways. First of all, in a broad sense, the evidence suggests that American Jews don't bring Israel into the center of their political deliberations in elections. And we have lots of data over the years where they've been asked the issues that matter, and whether Israel is mentioned or not, it seldom hits even double digits among the Jewish population. And so the question is, why isn't it more important in American elections, given that American Jews as a community are attached to Israel? There's variability, there's change, but it remains a strong focus of attachment. First of all, I think it's worth mentioning American Jews, like American voters in general, are concerned about domestic issues, much more so. The things which are immediate in their lives, healthcare, crime, social justice, things that impinge on their daily lives. And consequently, concerns about foreign policy, which would include Israel, are simply typically back burner issues. They don't affect, the bulk of the community doesn't see it as being relevant to the American elections. Secondly, the reality is American Jews don't really perceive major differences between the two parties on questions of Israel policy. There are differences of emphasis, but the core notion that American power should be used to produce a safe and secure Israel remains a matter of faith among both Democrats and Republicans. Certainly there are people in both parties who don't approve of that, but by and large, the central wings of the parties both support that position. So Israel doesn't sort of align itself in a way with party differences, despite Mr. Trump's outreach, President Trump's outreach to Prime Minister Netanyahu. The other thing that's really striking is that American Jews, whether they're liberals or conservatives, both consider themselves pro-Israel and don't really in that sense worry so much about the election. People who are liberals, more on the left, more likely to be Democrats, believe that to be pro-Israel is to criticize Israel, to try to make it better when they see it going in the wrong direction. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is not very popular with American Jews on the left. Conversely, Jews on the right, more conservative, more Republican, argue that the way you support Israel is to endorse its policy actions and its positions. And so President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, who seem to be close, okay, that's pro-Israel. But there hasn't really emerged a strong wing that sees it necessary to make this a voting issue in order to achieve that. I saw a really interesting survey this morning that we might get to, where the American Jewish community asked people which of the candidates they thought would be better on a number of policies. And one of them was maintaining the American-Israeli relationship. And while on most of these 78% of American Jews, being Democrats, thought that Vice President Biden was superior to President Trump. On Israel, it was a closer margin. It was about 54 saying Biden would be better, 40-some saying Trump would be better. And that means that a lot of people who believe that Trump would promote a closer relationship with Israel are nonetheless going to vote for Joe Biden. And part of it is because, again, since both parties are committed, they don't see it as a problem. And it's worth remembering that when President Obama was president and there were arguments that he and Netanyahu didn't have a close relationship, the strategic relationship between the two countries was, according to one of the top Israeli security aides, the best it had ever been. So it simply hasn't really been an issue that's divided the American parties in a way that would turn it into a partisan issue in voting or determine the vote choice, even if you're on the different side of the issue.
There's certainly been a lot of Republican efforts to highlight some particularly young members of the Democratic Party whose statements and comments have been ranging anywhere from anti-Semitic to anti-Israel. And I'm wondering, do you see a point where these types of appeals can work and where they can start to erode some Jewish support for the Democrats? Or do you think things are pretty much baked in and locked in as they are?
Yeah, I think it's important to distinguish between a couple of backbenchers, which is the term you would use, say, for Representative Omer or Representative Tlaib, who are probably the ones who have been most identified with those positions, and the bulk of the Democratic Party. They're young, they don't have much seniority, and there's not much evidence that they threaten American policy. And so while American Jews don't like those statements and do indeed consider them anti-Semitic, they haven't prompted a wholesale movement against the Democratic Party. There are countries where the Democratic Party, where the left-wing party has become much more vocally opposed to Israeli policy. I won't use the term anti-Semitic because that's a charged term, but in some of those parties, there have been accusations of anti-Semitism against parties on the left. The British Labour Party, for example, is perhaps the most notable example, but there are a lot more of them. And were the Democratic Party to go down that path, you could see a transformation of American Jewish loyalties, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think the party understands that and does not want to attack what is one of the core elements of its own base. So this will remain a kind of an outlier position, a position associated with some on the far left and not really central to the party's position. When people talk about concerns about anti-Semitism, the evidence shows what they are really concerned with is the kind of violence against Jews that we saw in Pittsburgh, in several places in California and elsewhere. And this is not a new movement. There were attacks on Jews, violent and sometimes fatal attacks on Jews, starting in the 1970s. And these movements came out of the fringe on the political right, the Christian identity movement, so-called. One of whose supporters tried to break into a Jewish day school and shoot people, didn't. One who did break into the Holocaust Museum in Washington and killed a security guard and the like. And we know about the anti-Jewish violence that's been perpetrated by people in the so-called alt-right, the people in Charlottesville, screaming Jews will not replace us, the killer in Pittsburgh and some of the other killers. And the evidence shows that American Jews today are much more concerned about anti-Semitism from the right side of the political movement and the community that has been supporting President Trump, the alt-right and the, groups like the Proud Boys and the like, than they are about anti-Semitism on the left. So I think that one party that has a problem with this is the Republicans. Here's a poll from 2018. This was actually done by Jim Gerstein, who you mentioned earlier. And this was shortly after the shootings in Pittsburgh. And people were asked, how much do you think Trump's comments are responsible for the recent shooting? And what you see is that when you add it together, 72% thought that Trump was very or somewhat responsible, as opposed to 28% who said he was not really responsible or not at all responsible. And so it becomes an issue, I think, that Jews tend to associate, for the most part, with the right wing. I think it's a distinction between thought, which may be anti-Semitic, versus action. And the action has really been on the right, as far as we know. So it's some recent stuff I've seen, some even more recent polls have shown that, again, Jews see the alt-right as much more of a danger than they see the representatives in Congress who you mentioned earlier.
I wonder to what extent, when you look at the Trump administration and some of the heavily publicized statements and comments of the administration, the Muslim ban, for instance, the refusal or reluctance to condemn anti-Semitism and white supremacy, and all of those kinds of issues, are Jews looking at discrimination against other groups and feeling a particular affinity in a particular sense that those who hate others will eventually hate us if they don't already? Do you see that going on?
Yeah, I think you see it really clearly if you go back to 2016 when Trump was first running. People, I think, forget that many people thought Trump should do very well among Jews in the 2016 election. He had a daughter who was Jewish, religiously observant. Of course, Hillary Clinton also had a Jewish grandchildren, as did Trump. It was one of the unspoken but really interesting facets of that election. But Trump was, had a lot of Jews who worked for him in the Trump organization. And he'd reached out to Jews, and he, of course, made the statement he would pull out of the Iran agreement, and, of course, would move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And so some people thought he'd do quite well among Democrats, among Jewish Democrats or Jews in general in 2016, yet he did not do well. He did about average, but given his advantages, that was a little surprising. And the striking thing is what really concerned a lot of Jews in general was the attack on other minorities. You may start with, Latinos, you may go after disabled people, you may attack Muslims, but the Jewish experience has been when you start with those groups, you're eventually going to get down to Jews as well. And Trump's unwillingness, even in 2016, to denounce people like David Duke and Richard Spencer, leaders of the alt-right, really, and then, appointing Steve Bannon, who's the patron of the alt-right, as chief of staff, really did worry American Jews. And so they did, in a sense, see this as really problematic. The really telling example of this, interestingly, is not from just the Jewish rank and file. It was from Jewish elites. There is an organization called the Republican Jewish Coalition, whose purpose for existing is to build support for Republican candidates among Jews. And they have a board of directors. And to get on that, you have to be a major contributor to Republican causes. And as of the last election cycle reported before the election, apparently a majority of Jewish members of the board of directors of the Republican Jewish Coalition did not contribute to the Republican presidential candidate in 2016. So this was a concern people had initially. And then as things unfolded, as the number of anti-Semitic incidents achieved record levels, as Trump continued to attack Muslims and other minority groups, and then as the violence occurred, it just became more and more of an issue. And again, some of the data that Jim Bernstein has produced really show how dramatic a difference this makes in Jewish attitudes.
So I'm wondering, when we look within the American Jewish community here, we're seeing certainly some sort of a divide between the more Orthodox on one side, the more less Orthodox, Reform Conservative, and all other denominations on the other. Is this a greater division than we've seen in the past, or is it just more visible now?
Well, it's hard to know, simply because it's really one of the challenges, as you know well, as a political scientist, is Jews are such a small share of the population that studying them is difficult. You've got the needle in a haystack problem. So some of the earlier surveys are not as reliable as one would wish. I suspect there has always been some tension there, but people, particularly journalists who have an ear to the ground, tell us that there's much more intense difference today within the community. When it does disagree, it disagrees more strongly. I can recommend Dov Waxman's book, Trouble in the Tribe, published in 2016, which does a really fine job of pointing out the internal divisions, political divisions among American Jews, and in particular, how Israel is one of the issues where this has really been manifest. Not the only one, but quite dramatic. And so I think that it is certainly getting more attention than it did before. And as I've said, with the changes on the Supreme Court and the like, it's probably going to continue to be a matter of real concern and a real division between the two communities, between the non-Orthodox, the proportion of Jews who either call themselves secular or just Jewish, and the more liberal traditions like Reform and Reconstructionist, politically liberal, versus the more Orthodox sides.
So what would be if you had to predict, and I know political scientists are always much better at explaining why something in the past had to happen rather than predicting what will happen in the future. Mm-hmm. But if you had to predict, how do you expect the Democratic ticket to do this year, say compared to 2020 and 2016, at the presidential level?
Okay. I think what we're going to see is an intensification of what we saw in 2018, when in the congressional vote, the House of Representatives vote, the data that Jim Bernstein survey that he provided to scholars, the split between Democrats and Republicans among Jews was about 80-20 in favor of Democratic candidates for Congress, a 4-to-1 split in the population. And I think we're going to go closer to that direction. And I've been saying this for some time. And I was very pleased this morning when I found data that had just come out from the American Jewish Committee's annual survey of American Jews. Cole, that's the last slide, number 8. Can you show us that? Okay. So this is from a survey conducted from September through October. And by now, opinions are pretty well established. And it's an unusually good survey for technical reasons that I won't go into. But of all the projections, this is the one that I find most persuasive. And if you look at the top, people were asked, again, this was a large Jewish sample, about 1,300. If the election were today, who would you vote for? And what you see is a very substantial split, 75% of Jews saying they'd vote for Biden, 22% for Trump, and then another 5% giving smaller answers. I should point out, those of you who do the addition will see this comes to 102%. And that's not because Jews are so active in participation that they exceed 100%. Our best guess from what we've been talking about today is that the other is 3%, and it somehow combines these 3 categories. But anyway, that's a huge margin, 75 to 22. And if you just, if you take away those in the other categories, the Democrats, Joe Biden would get close to 77% of the vote. So that would be, again, closer to what we saw in 2018. And again, you look at the issues and what drives this, overwhelmingly concerned about the pandemic and healthcare. That's the number 1 issue for 43% of Jews surveyed. The economy, 13, race relations, 12, crime, 6. No other single issue coming close to the concerns about healthcare. But I think underneath it all, I think some of the people who talk about race relations are talking about not simply Black Lives Matter, but what they see as President Trump's language about attacking minority groups as well. So I'm expecting, at least among Jews, something very much like a blue wave. It'll be closer to the Obama split than the Clinton split in terms of the relative balance of Jews voting for Democratic rather than Republican. I'd also add that part of the enthusiasm has to do, I think, with the vice presidential candidate this year. Kamala Harris, as many people know, is married to a Jewish man. And his adult children, who apparently adore her, call her Mamala, using the Yiddish term, a play on Kamala as her name. And I think she's extremely popular among Jewish women. And I think she will help maintain this kind of division in this current election. So I think that, again, I don't expect to see much dramatic change, but I expect Jews to continue to be, as they have been, the most pro-democratic white Anglo group in the electorate.
I know they drilled into us in graduate school that when you ask people in public opinion surveys, do you plan to vote, people lie. And people who are not planning to vote are quite likely to say that, yes, they are going to vote. We know the social desirability response. And I've looked over a lot of data, but I've never seen something that shows 1% saying they're not planning to vote. And I know that there's obviously some lie there, but this is still outrageously high participation. Can you talk about Jewish participation in general? Again, no one's expecting 99% Jewish voter turnout, but do we expect, and have we historically gotten much higher Jewish voter turnout?
Well, what we can say with some confidence based on data is that Jews tend to turn out to vote at very high rates compared to the rest of the electorate. And it's not clear if that has anything to do with their being Jewish, because the factors that tend to promote voter participation are qualities like education, occupational status, income, location in metropolitan areas, and the like. And all of those factors tend to promote voter participation, and Jews tend to be disproportionately high on each one of those. So other voter groups that have the same traits probably have similarly high levels of turnout. And so in that sense, it's believed that Jews participate more. Jews do another thing that we can document. They are far more likely to contribute to candidates than most other voter groups. And that money goes to parties in rough proportion to the data we've seen before. Typically, $3 out of $4 given by Jewish donors goes to Democratic candidates, and only a quarter of it goes to Republican candidates. And that's another reason why Jews matter, even if their numbers are small. Doesn't mean that Jews control the electorate or own everything, as people in the alt-right say, but it just shows that they're politically engaged. In other respects, we don't find a lot of evidence that Jews are different from other voters. I did a work on so-called civic participation, volunteerism in sort of good government activities, community improvement, and Jews had about the same level of participation as other groups. So I think that because Jews are more likely to be, and I guess there isn't one other sense that argues in favor of this, Jews have higher rates of volunteering for political parties, particularly for the Democratic Party. They're very active in party organizations, campaigning, and the like. And I think, those are factors that do make Jews more active in electoral politics, particularly at the presidential level. I don't know that it extends much beyond that.
So some few questions that have been raised here that I want to throw at you. So you are, of course, certainly a prototypical Jewish person from the Plains State, maybe from the Plains States, maybe the broader Midwest. Marty and I are sitting here as two, New York Jews from Brooklyn, Queens, Long Island. What are the differences in, say, Midwest Jews and East Coast Jews? Is that something that's been studied a fair bit?
There really isn't a lot of sort of regional work. And part of the problem is, again, Jews are a small share of the electorate, and they're even a smaller share in the Midwest, as you know.
Particularly in Nebraska, I would imagine.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, so there isn't as much study being done. In the community I grew up in, to be a Jew was to be a Democrat. And most of the people who lived in that community were third or fourth generation Americans. In fact, I knew of only one Jewish Republican in this entire town, and it happened to be my father, I should point out. And he wouldn't have been considered a Republican today because my father strongly believed in national health insurance and heavy public investment in public transportation, because he said, as a business person, those are things that keep your workers healthy, give them transportation, and of course, those are pro-business policies. He would have no place whatsoever in today's Republican Party. And eventually, I should point out, he became a political independent for other reasons. And my sense of other communities is there's not dramatic regional differences. I lived in the South for 8 years, and apart from the fact that they have very different accents and considered me an Anglo-Saxon, I didn't find, Jews in the South to be particularly different politically. They were more nervous during the Civil Rights Movement because that was particularly threatening to Southern Jews. If they were seen, national Jewish organizations strongly supported the Civil Rights Movement, and that made white Southern Jews put them in an awkward position, and they did experience some violence and the like. But I'm not impressed at the magnitude of the regional differences. I did see, that there were times I thought that Jews in the Midwest seemed to me sort of in some ways like Methodists, the dominant tradition in the Midwest. And there were times when I lived in Memphis, I once gave a talk in an Orthodox shul, and I felt that, these were Baptist Jews, just because of the sort of style. So I think there's stylistic differences, but I don't find dramatic political differences. And it may be that, with better data and more Jewish, new techniques that enable us to get at Jewish voters more easily, we may find some, but I don't see big differences that jump out at me. We all argue about where the best bagels are, but apart from that, probably not much.
I know a number of people here in the audience have probably seen my Facebook rants about bagels, so I'll duck that issue here. And we have a question here that somebody is asking if you could expand upon your earlier statement about Jewish attitudes toward affirmative action.
Yeah. The problem with affirmative action among Jews who were critical of it, and I want to stress there was division in the community about it, was to them it appeared, and I'm repeating a perspective here, that public benefits were being allocated on the basis of race. Now, this was particularly true in the early stages of affirmative action when people were adopting quotas for, if you have a certain share of the population, that group should get a certain share of, public positions or government jobs and the like. And to many in the Jewish community, that was problematic, partly because Jews have been the victims of quota historically. I know when I applied for college, there were universities that my parents made it clear there was no point applying to because they had strict Jewish quotas, and I probably wasn't going to make it over the threshold. And so part of that is the experience that quotas were used to discriminate against Jews, and consequently, they make Jews nervous. But there was also a philosophical issue that it appeared that Jews who worked hard through their own efforts were not getting benefits because other groups who didn't have the same quote unquote objective levels of background and training and so forth were getting preferences. Now, it's worth pointing out that that kind of affirmative action disappeared fairly quickly. What was called hard affirmative action evolved into soft affirmative action, in which case, instead of quotas, you had goals. And affirmative action was judged more by your efforts than necessarily the results. And it's worth pointing out that Jewish organizations, even when they challenged what they called quotas, supported active efforts to promote equality of opportunity. That was not true of many of the other opponents of affirmative action, who would have done away with equal employment opportunity laws and things of that nature. Jews remained committed to those concerns of the civil rights movement, but they felt that the early affirmative action programs went too far. And if you looked at Jewish opinion in this period, the striking thing is it was very close to overall American public opinion. And that's rare because Jews almost always stand out as being more liberal no matter what the policy question. But they were divided on affirmative action in a way that I think they hadn't been before. And ultimately that question had to kind of leave the agenda with time before other concerns reasserted themselves and brought Jews back to what had traditionally been their partisan home, the Democratic Party.
And this was a lot of this was around the time like of the 1968 New York City teachers strike. That was a fairly big deal around that.
Sure. That became an enormous issue. And Jewish voters were very concerned about the school system, as you well know, and Marty knows, was an important agent of upward social mobility for Jews in New York. It was seen as a very, an organization friendly to Jews and open to Jews, and uniquely important in the community. And when demands for community control became demands for hiring, Black principals and Black, teachers instead of Jews, transferring Jewish teachers out, that was really a difficult thing for Jews to deal with in New York. But the evidence shows it was kind of limited in its long-term impact, that Jews actually voted for John Lindsay's reelection, even in the midst of that controversy, whereas the Italian Americans and the other ethnic groups that opposed affirmative action did not. They went heavily the other partisan direction, and it helped permanently kind of drive them out of the Democratic camp. But it was difficult. And I remember hearing a very thoughtful lecture by a leading Jewish philosopher, a longtime liberal active in politics, giving a criticism of affirmative action from a Jewish perspective. And while I didn't necessarily accept everything he said, I thought it was a thoughtful commentary. And it was a tough issue for Jews because our impulses to support other discriminated against groups ran headlong into our concern that we not be the victims of discrimination and be punished for what people felt was hard work and effort and so forth. And I think that's why Jews, at the young Jews today, were very sympathetic, according to what we've seen, to the Black Lives Matter movement, because they see the social injustice as something that violates what they perceive as core Jewish values, and why I think they were very attracted to the movement.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about similarities between Jewish and Catholic voting, and particularly how that might play out in 2020.
Mm-hmm. Well, there was a time when Jews and Catholics were both core elements of the Democratic coalition. We talked about the period from 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt first ran for president, until about 1948 or the early 50s. As the period of the New Deal coalition being the key factor. And Jews and Catholics were together as heavily Democratic. Now, again, not all Catholics. It broke down somewhat by ethnic groups, and strangely enough, Italian Jews who lived on Long Island, Italian Catholics who lived in Long Island were still Republican, and there's all that finite distinction that you see in New York politics. But in general, Catholics were working class and they benefited from the New Deal. It was also the case that Democratic politicians tended to be much more open to having Catholics involved in public life and public service. And so Catholics and Jews seemed to get along. Jews also at that period had a sizable number of industrial workers who were in trade unions. And again, that was the New Deal's center of gravity. So they were fairly close together. And then they began to split in the 60s over many of the social issues, not simply affirmative action, but questions about liberalized sexuality, birth control, abortion, sexual orientation, those kinds of questions, where a lot of Catholics following the hierarchy went to the right, and Jews in the main objected to the idea that public policy should reflect any religious group's particular understanding. So the idea that you find in Catholicism that abortion is the murder of innocence, and that is the official position taken by the Catholic Church, to Jews seems like using the Catholic definition of life as public policy. And again, that's problematic. Jews in that case are much more likely to say, let individuals make those moral decisions. So the two groups have moved. Now, Catholicism today is two real communities. There's white Catholics, and then there's Catholics of color, where I would include not just Latino Catholics and Black Catholics, but also Asian American Catholics as well. And in a sense, you've got two different communities there. One, the traditional white Anglo-Catholics being more heavily Republican, and the other, you've got the Catholics of color being disproportionately Democratic. So there really is there never was a Catholic vote in the pure sense of the term, but it's much more split internally. And because the two wings are about equal in population size, you have a 50-50 division, but it really cuts, it doesn't so much cut within those groups, it cuts between those two groups. So Jews and Catholics, if you look at the majority on the Supreme Court that's accommodationist, all but one of the justices is Catholic. This assumes that Justice Barrett or Judge Barrett will become Justice Barrett. And if you look for the opposition on most of those votes that have taken place, it will be mostly Jewish, Breyer and Kagan, along with Judge Sotomayor, the other ethnic minority on the court. The rest of the justices, on those issues tend to be much more sympathetic to Catholic doctrine. Jews, of course, see the issue in a very different way.
So let me throw out one more question to you here. So American Jews are about 2.5% or so, 2.5–3% of the American population. Why do those votes, why do American Jews matter so much in American presidential elections? Why is this an important voting bloc to pay attention to? And then a second part of the question, why does understanding the politics of American Jews help us to understand American voting behavior and political science more?
Good, great questions to end with. I think Jews get attention from parties in politics because they are strategically located. Where do you find the bulk of the Jewish community? And the answer is in the large urbanized states, which carry the bulk of the Electoral College. Now, they're underrepresented statistically because of the way the Electoral College is apportioned, but Jews are New York, New Jersey, California, Illinois, Michigan, significant concentrations, and the like. And so they're in states that the Democrats really have to capture and have traditionally been part of it. Florida has become more competitive because of the growth of the Jewish population, along with the influx of non-Cuban Latinos who tend to be more heavily Democratic. So Jews are found where the votes are, and in that sense, they get a lot of attention. Secondly, Jews have a reputation, to use the language of pollsters, as super voters. That is, if they are registered to vote, well, first of all, they're registered high levels, not necessarily because they're Jews, but again, highly educated, high income, high status people are more likely to register to vote. Jews have those qualities more so than many other groups on average, and therefore they register. And when they register, they tend to vote at very high levels. So Jews turn out. they're there and the like. And they tend to be fairly politically literate, again, in part because of, various aspects of the tradition. And Jews also, as I said, participate as volunteers in campaigns well beyond their numbers. They're more likely to be candidates than their numbers alone would lead you to believe. And as I mentioned before, Jews are significant donors to political campaigns. So all of that makes Jews worth appealing to if you look at it from the perspective of campaign. What I think we can learn about Jews, the thing that has always interested me about these various puzzles about American Jews is if you think about it, Jews, as you say, are a tiny sliver of the American population. The number's been essentially constant for many years now at around 6 million, even though the percentage has dropped because the overall population has grown. And to me, they're an interesting case how a minority group that has a history of experiencing discrimination can somehow succeed in electoral politics, a system that is based on raw numbers. And to me, it's interesting to watch how Jews have managed to utilize the opportunities they have in the United States by virtue of the fact that citizenship doesn't depend on religion, that the state doesn't have a formal religious identity, that religious tests are illegal for holding public office, and utilize that power of a minority to exert some influence in American life and to be available to safeguard American Jewish life if they see it threatened. So I think the fact that it's an interesting example of a minority group that has achieved some success, despite the fact that it doesn't follow the majority line in matters of religion and differs in some other respects. It's not alone. I'm fascinated by Indian Americans who are really mobilized this year because of Kamala Harris, whose mother, of course, was Indian. And I predicted the minute her name came up that there would be a surge of political participation by Indian Americans, and was pleased to see the New York Times a few weeks ago acknowledge this and talk about that phenomenon. And there are other groups who I think have similar kinds of histories, even though they're small in number. They may be different in race, they may be different in language, they may be different in color, but they find ways to utilize this political system to pursue the interests of their community as they see it. And to me, that's just extremely important. American Jews are a success story, despite all the problems we've talked about. The life, I compare my life to that of my parents, who were German Jews, who were forced out of the country, whose parents were murdered. And I contrast that with the life I've been able to lead here. And in part that's due to a lot of things, but certainly the fact that we have a political system that gives a voice to individuals and gives Jews opportunities politically is a key part of that.
And I want to thank you so much for being with us this evening. As many of you listening in know, I'm a real big fan of EMU, and I certainly love that institution. But if there is one institution in the world that I do love more than Eastern Michigan University, it might be Washington University. And as a fellow alum, you did the WashU Bears proud this evening.
Thank you. Glad to hear it.
It was wonderful to have you with us. And thank you all, everybody who joined us. I'm going to turn it back to Marty for some final words.
I'd like to thank Jeff and very, very much thank Ken. That was brilliant and fascinating and obviously very, very, very timely. And I'd like to thank all of you who came this evening, and we appreciate your joining us. You make the Center for Jewish Studies possible. It's been a wonderful evening. I wish you all a great night. Please note on your calendars November 23rd from Marshall Duke, and join us again. I wish you a beautiful evening. Stay safe and be careful out there. We live in dangerous times. Good evening.